And I've got to, I'll put up the quote I started with last week, give you a sense of where we were. But this is just a little bit of history and sort of the life of John Calvin, and then in particular, what happened in the city of Geneva, right? So John Calvin and Geneva. Of course, the motto for Geneva becomes, right, thanks to Calvin, after the darkness comes the light, right? So that's the motto that Geneva adopts as part of its coat of arms and things like that after this age, right, in the 1500s. So last week, is that too, is it okay? Okay, good. I ask you just to think about this statement, right? What I want to get at is sort of what is this stamp of Geneva, right? So Calvin is from France, goes to Geneva, and helps reform Geneva into a Protestant city, and it becomes kind of this model city. But here's a statement made by an American historian in the last century, right, that essentially all Americans have the stamp of Geneva on them, right? And what is that stamp of Geneva, right? So what I want to emphasize is not so much the theology, that's very important and the most important thing, right, in terms of Calvin's thought and Reformed thinking and our theology here at Trinity. But I want to spend a few minutes on the other things, right, that the stamp of Geneva has a lot to do with the way we organize our lives and the way we organize the church and maybe even the way we think about politics a little bit, right? Calvin is that influential, not just theologically, of course, again, very important. So this stamp of Geneva is broader than that. So I just wanted to spend a couple Sunday school sessions on kind of the other side, right, or some of the other things about Calvin. So if I get into the weeds too much, I'm a historian by training, my apologies. I always easily get into the weeds, right, because all the details matter, right, and where someone's going and what they're eating for breakfast are important, right? It shapes history, right? So Calvin and the stamp of Geneva. So last week, we looked at his early life, and we got him all the way to the steps of Geneva. He is there. He is asked by William Farel, right, Will Farel, right, to stay with him in Geneva, right? And it's where we left off at 11 o'clock last week, right? That Calvin doesn't want to stay. He wants to go on to Strasbourg. He wants to read books. He wants to write books. He wants to have a little corner, he says, where I can just do those things, right? He's a thinker. He's a writer, right? He doesn't want to get involved in the rough and tumble of daily life if he can avoid it, right? That's not the way his life works out, right, of course, because he shows up in Geneva and Farel says, God wants you to stay. Calvin says, no, he doesn't. Farel says, no, he does, right? And famously, if you don't stay, God will condemn you. And Calvin says, I'll stay, right? Okay. So now Farel's been working. Will Farel, this again, already a reformer. He's of the previous generation. He's Martin Luther's age, right? So he's been working in Swiss cities and German cities, Neuchâtel. He's been most recently in the city of Bern. And Bern, in 1532, decides to send Farel to Geneva on a mission of reform. They actually bombard the city with pamphlets. They sort of send in thousands and thousands of paper pamphlets to sort of precede the Reformation there. He shows up in 1532, so he's been working for 3 or 4 years, right? Then Calvin shows up in 1536. So again, Farel's been in Basel, Neuchâtel, Bern, now he's in Geneva, right? Okay, so now let's switch to Geneva, right? This is where we left off. Again, try not to give you too much kind of the historical stuff, but it's important. What's Geneva like, right? What's the situation in Geneva? Really complicated, right? It's a mess on so many levels, but part of it is historical, right? What's Geneva? Well, first, it's an imperial city. So it's part of the old Holy Roman Empire, right? And over centuries, towns and cities would get charters, cartas, the Magna Charter, right? The Magna Carta is just one of these kinds of charters that you can basically be a free city, right? You'll have overlordship, the empire will, but you can do what you want, right? Don't bother us, we won't bother you. Essentially, we want you existing and flourishing without too much imperial control. The primary governor will be a bishop, the Bishop of Geneva. So it's a prince-bishopric, right? Okay, that's one piece. Over time, however, again, things change over time, a duchy is created between Italy and France called Savoy. This duchy, right? So here's Italy down here, here's France up here. The Duchy of Savoy is kind of a new, powerful dukedom, right? And they start claiming authority with imperial support over Geneva, right? And over the bishop. So the Duke of Savoy and the Bishop of Geneva sort of both have control over Geneva. So that's a second piece, right? You've got Savoy. Then you have France, right? All through the late 1400s and early 1500s, France is exploding. They've got a new young king named Francis. He thinks he's a Renaissance prince, think Henry VIII. He wants to take over everything, right? Savoy is the highway to Italy, right? So France, Savoy, Italy. So if you want to go conquer Italy, you have to go through Savoy. So France is a big, powerful outside threat as well, right? To Savoy, to Geneva, okay. All right, then add another layer. All towns, just about, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 20,000, right, have long-standing traditions of freedom, right? If you live in a city in Europe, right, you're considered free, right? There's an old sentiment, right? Town air makes one free, right? What are you free from? Lordship, right? If you're a merchant in any town in Europe, you're often called a freeman, right? In England, it becomes this way. I study England more than anything else, right? When you become a member of London, you become a freeman, right? Free from what? Free from lordship. Now, you're still under the king, yes, but you have liberties that have been promised to you. Again, a carta of liberties, right? The Magna Carta, the Magna Charter, the Magna Covenant, the Magna Contract, all the same thing, right? Every town has a carta, has a charter, right? You're free. Again, let me show you. Again, I get excited about this stuff, but I know it's history you might not want to know. Who's free in this little village? This is any medieval village, any time between the year 900 and nobody, right? Not, all the people here are serfs, right? Peasants. Who do they have to obey? In whatever little village, Grantchester or whatever, right? The lord of the manor, right? The landlord lives in the castle, right? The landlord is your literal lord, right? And the pastor of the church is appointed by the landlord, right? So the church is controlled by the landlord, the manor lord. No one's free in a medieval village. Who does the lord of the manor report to? His lord, right? Again, think chess set, right? This is the medieval social order, right? Where do dentists fit there? Lawyers, dentists, bankers, merchants, professors. They don't, right? We're not on that map, right? We're not on this scheme. This is the ideal medieval social order. Everyone has a lord, right? Everyone is subject to someone else's control, right? Towns don't fit in, right? Cities don't fit in. Why not? Why don't cities fit in, right? What do merchants need to do every day? Need to travel. So what would be one of your liberties, right? Freedom to travel. So if you're a merchant of Venice, where can you go? Anywhere you want. And you have guarantee in your back pocket that says, I'm free to travel, right? I can't even be arrested while I'm traveling. We have that in our political system, right? If you're a member of the House of Representatives and you're traveling to Washington, D.C., you can't be arrested, right? You have to have the freedom to go and get back, right? This goes all the way back here to town air makes one free. Okay. All of these urban traditions become popular, right? You might even think, I'm a farmer, I'm a serf, but boy, I would like to be free. I'm going to run away to the city, right? That becomes a thing, right? Okay, so Geneva has all these traditions as well, right? These traditions of urban freedom, right? Any town in Europe is going to have this kind of feel to it, right? Could we be freer, right? Okay. So what's just happened in Geneva is a true Republican revolution and a Protestant Reformation at the same time. 1532, Farel comes in, they declare themselves a republic. The town of Bern wants them to be a republic, totally free of any lordship, right? And Protestant, right? So Farel is really behind all this. Bern, why do you think they would want Geneva to be independent? Let me go back to this map. Well, Bern's not on that one, sorry. There's Bern. Why is Bern so interested in Geneva being a republic? Free from the Duke of Savoy. They kick their bishop out in 1532 so that they can influence Geneva, right? So Bern has their own interests, right? Bern wants Geneva to be Protestant, and they want Geneva to become a republic. Both things happen, right as Calvin arrives, right? So this is the situation Calvin's stepping into. Quick questions, thoughts about cities, urbanism, liberties, right? A charter of liberties, right, is the common thing every town would have. Thoughts? Making sense? Yes?
At what point did those urban traditions start? Was that something that was left over from the Roman Empire, or?
Great question. It really is medieval, right? Because it has to do with cash, right? Okay. Knight so-and-so, Duke so-and-so, Lord so-and-so, all through early medieval history, money doesn't exist, right? So if I'm the Count of Bradley, right? So I'm the Count of Bradley. I don't have any money, but I own all of your chickens, all of your cows, all of your trees, and all of you, right? So my income is you, and your chickens, and your cows, and your wheat, and your barley, right? I don't have any gold coins. They don't exist. The entire treasury of England can fit in a box, right, in the king's bedroom, right, in a big chest, right? But who starts to create cash and coins and standard coinage, and what is that sort of, how do we get a cash economy? Those merchants of Venice again, right? So it's these Italian merchants create a cash economy, and then kings or lords. So if I'm an entrepreneurial Count of Bradley, I would say, you know what? I want cash too. How about I invite some merchants to Southeast Tennessee, and I'll give them a charter of liberties to set up Cleveland. And Cleveland will be free of my control, except they have to pay me a yearly sum, because I want their cash, right? So Cleveland becomes free of lordship, but they have to pay me an annual price for it. Yeah. So this is very medieval, right? This is how this is all developing. Again, the Italians are sort of behind it, right? The Italians possess neither king nor prince to govern them, but only judges appointed by themselves, right? The northern Italian cities are sometimes republics, right? Okay. So Geneva has just had this reform, Farel's Geneva then. He arrives in 1532. The bishop is expelled. In 1535, the first major Protestant sort of reforming effort takes root. The Mass is suspended, so no longer performing of the Mass as a sacrament, replaced by the Lord's Supper, right? 1536, the large council in Geneva, all towns have a council of 200, a council of 500, or something like that. They decree, right, they pass a law that papal ceremonies and abuses, images, and idols are now outlawed, and we, the Genevans, will live by the holy law of the gospel and the word of God. Right? So this is happening 1536, right before Calvin shows up. Right? This is happening almost simultaneously. And the city of Bern is providing the military power behind them, right? Because if you kick out the bishop and the duke, you're causing political trouble, right? But the military of Bern says, we'll help you out, right? We'll defend you, we'll keep you safe from France, from Savoy, and from the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Bernese are scary. Their symbol is a bear, right? That's a great image of a Bernese warrior there, right? You never mess with the Swiss militarily, right? Now, again, the French could beat the Swiss because they outnumber them, but you don't want to if you don't have to. Okay, so Bern provides the military muscle for all of this, right? Okay, back to Calvin. So Calvin shows up in 36. He and Farel are excited, right? Now they're going to work hard and quickly for a full Reformation, right? Calvin's position, he's never an elected officer. He's never Pope of Geneva, right? Sometimes he's called that. He's a reader in Holy Scripture to the Church of Geneva. That's his official position in these early years. So just a participant in the ecclesiastical side of things. He and Farel produce almost right away in 1537 articles for reform. And this is to get the church reformed, society reformed. We're going to fix Geneva. It's a little too fast, right? They're kind of too excited. This is an all-encompassing reform document. I'll say more about it in a second. They also write a brief confession, so a Genevan confession, and a Genevan catechism right away. And these things they start to impose. First, let me just walk you through some of this. They're going to fail here, right? This is going to be a failed attempt. First, citizenship they linked to confession. So if you confess, right, this Genevan confession, kind of like the Westminster Confession, then your citizenship can be linked to that. You'll be a citizen of Geneva, right? Your citizenship depends on you confessing, right? If you're not going to confess a Protestant Reformed, right, belief system, then you can stay in Geneva, but you're not going to have political rights. They start working on reforming the worship of the church, the doctrine, and the morality all at once. Calvin's big effort is to get laws that are on the books enforced. So these aren't new laws. These are laws against dancing, right? Every town has laws against dancing in 1536. But Calvin said, let's do what? Let's enforce it. And who dances? You know, let's go back to our medieval village, right? Who dances, right? It's always fun to talk about dancing in Sunday school, right? Who dances, right? So peasants are going to dance when? What? Harvest, there'll be, there's the annual church calendar has lots of built-in celebration days, and people are going to dance, and it's okay, right? There's going to be lots of stuff to drink, and on these festivities, and okay, every once in a while, peasant dancing. We can imagine that, right? Who dances more often than that? Who dances a lot? Oh, the lords, right? The wealthy, the aristocrats, right? So what does Calvin decide to do? We're going to impose the ban on dancing for everyone, right? Those who are wealthy included. This does not go over well, right? The law applies to all, right? Even those in Geneva used to doing what they want to do, right? And when they want to do it. So this causes turmoil right away. I mean, he just showed up. He's a Frenchman. He's not Genevan. They call him just the French guy. That's his name in Geneva, right? The French guy's here, right? Farel's French too, right? Okay. So they don't have a lot of success right away in their first reform efforts. Controversy hits winter, spring 1538. 1538. It's political and religious. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. 1538. in a republic, you have factions, right? Because anytime you have government of the people, by the people, for the people, you're going to have lots of factions, right? And the primary faction that's dominating the government is pro-Bern. Whatever the Bernese say, we'll do, because they're our military protection, right? So Bern says, we want you to have worship services, liturgies, just like us. And Calvin and Farel really don't care that much about the particulars. I mean, they care in general, right? But they're not against this. But the city government says, we will follow Bern, and they sign an agreement with Bern without asking John Calvin and without asking Will Ferrell, right? The city government has just done what to the church? The mayor of Cleveland has just done what to Trinity, right? Told us how to worship, right? Calvin and Farel say, not having it, right? So Easter morning, Lord's Supper, right? Calvin says, we're not celebrating it today, right? In protest, right? The Bernese used unleavened bread, and the Genevans used leavened bread. But again, that's not the issue. It's the issue, but it's not the issue, right? The issue is the government told the church what to do without asking, right? So Farel and Calvin say, we're not doing it. Calvin was ordered not to preach. What does he do, of course? Preaches a really long sermon. And the next morning, he's given his walking papers. Farel and Calvin are kicked out in spring of 1538, kicked out of Geneva, right? Again, primarily political, right? Because the Bernese are trying to protect Geneva, and this faction says we've got to obey the Bernese. But the issue for us, as we think about it, is the state told the church what to do without the church's agreement or consultation at least, right? Okay, so Farel and Calvin are out. Where do they go? They go to Strasbourg, right? Now remember Strasbourg, that's where Calvin wanted to go anyway, right? From last week. That was his goal anyway, is to get to Strasbourg. Now he's there as an exile, right? Or sort of like an exile, right? Who's in Strasbourg? Martin Butzer. Butzer is, again, a Lutheran reformer. He was one of Luther's first great supporters. Some of you might remember Don Bowdle, right? If you have Lee connections. Or Don Bowdle was actually influential in Trinity. He helped us get started all these years ago. He taught Sunday school at Trinity. He was one of the original Presbycostals, right? Theology professor at Lee. Pentecostal, but very Presbyterian. But Martin Butzer was one of his favorites, right? Because Butzer was a nice guy, right? If you know Don Bowdle. Butzer was happy, optimistic, nice, pleasant. That doesn't describe a lot of famous reformers, right? Just kind of an easy go along to get along kind of guy, right? Butzer's just a really, really good mentor, right? Calvin loves him, right? So Calvin finally gets to kind of work with Butzer. Calvin is appointed pastor of the French refugee church in Strasbourg. And there's quite a few refugees. Strasbourg has been a Protestant city now for a full decade, right? Even a little bit longer. So Strasbourg's a place to learn how do we make a city Protestant? How do we create a reformed city? You know, Butzer is sort of Calvin's mentor here in Strasbourg, right? Worship. I give you a little handout sheet. When he gets to Strasbourg and takes over, he's so excited about the way the French refugees are worshiping. He says, right, everyone sings, men and women, and it is a lovely sight. Each has a music book in hand. As I looked on this little company of exiles, I wept, not for sadness, but for joy, to hear them all singing so heartily. And as they sang, gave thanks to God that he had led them to a place where his name is glorified, right? So this is Calvin in Strasbourg, right? Excited about his little French congregation, right? But again, it's impacting his approach to worship and to Reformation. So he takes over as pastor of French refugees. There are a lot of other reformers there. Again, the Zells, Matthew and Catherine, are very important leaders. Catherine, she essentially devotes her life to her husband's ministry, but then when he dies, she continues it, right? So she's kind of famous as someone who plays the role of a reformer in situations that she wouldn't normally be allowed to. She actually delivers the eulogy at her husband's funeral. That's just not done, but she's such a good speaker, such an important person in Strasbourg. Wolfgang Capito is there, again, another great reformer. So Calvin's really enjoying this, right? This feels good. And he gets married, right? Butzer says, I've got a woman for you. Calvin says, I guess so, right? And they get married. That's about how it happened, right? I mean, there's no courtship, there's no nothing. It's like, you, good, got it. And that's how Martin Luther and Katie Luther met too. Katie was a nun, and they were matching up nuns and husbands, and she kept saying no, right? And she was the last one, and she goes, Katie, who are you waiting for? She goes, well, I want Martin, right? And so he says, okay. Right. Okay, similar with Calvin. They link up. She's a widow. Her husband was an Anabaptist, but she's in Strasbourg too, right? So they get married, and it is a happy marriage. Again, we don't have lots of personal statements from Calvin, but upon her death, we get a little bit of emotion, thinking of, again, the sermon earlier. People express their emotions differently, right? But Calvin does upon the death of his wife, right? I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life, of one who, had it been so ordered, would not only have been the willing sharer of my indigence, but even of my death. During her life, she was the faithful helper of my ministry. This best companion of his life. So it's a short marriage, right? She dies in 49, but it is a happy marriage. Calvin is beginning to get sicker, but at this point he's still fairly healthy. But the rest of his adult life, he will be terribly ill. A couple other things in Strasbourg. Psalm singing becomes really sort of standard for Calvin's way of thinking. These later get called jigs, Geneva dances. Queen Elizabeth in England hates these things. Why does she hate them? They're too upbeat. Can you imagine psalm singing being criticized as too upbeat, right? Elizabeth I can't stand them. Like, get that rowdy music out of here, right? So psalm singing becomes a piece of Geneva's Reformation too, right? And lastly, education. Philip Melanchthon, the kind of leader of the education world in Germany, he takes over for Luther on many things, but he's often called the preceptor of Germany. He had been pushing for this new model, we would sort of call it high school, right, called the gymnasium or the gymnasium, in which you study scripture and languages in your teen years, right? And then you're prepared for either a career in public service, again, probably on to university first, right? But this is Melanchthon's model, and Calvin falls in love with it. He actually accepts the role of teacher at the Strasbourg Gymnasium, the Strasbourg Gymnasium. Again, emphasizing scripture, languages, all these humanist things. Again, humanism is a good word, right? Study Greek, study Latin, study Hebrew, and literature in general, right? Okay, so all this is happening in Strasbourg, right? He's happy. Then Geneva comes calling, right? The factions have changed, and they want Calvin back. So they go ask him, and what does he say, right? No, I'm not leaving, right? I would rather suffer 100 deaths than bear that cross on which one must perish 1,000 times daily. Right, but my timidity suggested to me many reasons for excusing myself from again willingly taking upon my shoulders so heavy a burden. At length, however, a solemn and conscientious regard to my duty prevailed with me to consent to return to the flock from which I had been torn. But with what grief, tears, and great anxiety and distress I did this. The Lord is my witness, right? So he goes back to Geneva with anxiety and tears and great anxiety. Leaves happy Strasbourg, he and Idolette go back to Geneva. They leave this church behind, right, headed for Geneva. As soon as he gets back, again, it's their request this time, right? He doesn't just show up. The government comes begging. So they appoint him to two committees right away. First, to fix the political constitution of Geneva. He's put on the Republican committee, right, to write a new constitution, and the ecclesiastical reform committee. So he's got two tasks, right? Fix the political world and fix the church world, right? It's two small things, right? He spends the rest of his life doing this, right? I mean, this is the rest of his life from 1541 to 1564. This is what he does, right? Again, first, politics, very briefly. We won't go through all of this. Actually, let's just look at the handout. If you have the little chart, it's on the second page. He's going to fix the Constitution. So you can see Geneva here, right? So look at the left side, Republican Geneva. Now, many of these pieces of government were already in place. He just organizes it, right? Sets up rules, regulations, procedures. First, you have a General Assembly of all citizens, right? That meets once a year. Then you have a council of 200. They do a lot of the hard work of governing Geneva. The Council of 60 does primarily foreign affairs, right? Diplomacy, things like that. And then the most important institution, right, coming out of this reform is the Senate, the little council that is called, right? A council of 25. That's the executive council of Geneva. So most of these things existed, but he just packages them in a new way, right? That left side of the chart takes form. The Senate or the little council will really make all the really tough choices, the executive council. But they are, right, submissive to the other councils. So early modern republics have all these multiple councils in order to have sort of checks and balances, right? So that little council is most important, the Senate. Just one thing for you, right? More than 10% of the citizens in Geneva held office, right? Republics are supposed to be participatory, right? That's one of the great traditions of republicanism, little r, right, is participation, right? Without participation, you can't have a government of lots of councils and all of these things, right? Okay, so he fixes that side, right? And that will be not stable, but it works, right? And then he turns to the church, right? The ecclesiastical organization. So the right side of the handout. And this is where he spends most of his time, right? But again, he was asked to lead in both affairs, political and religious. Not as an officer, not as anyone who had authority, just because they offered it to him, right? His official title now is pastor of St. Peter, of St. Pierre, right? All right, ecclesiastical organization, 4 ordinance, 4 ministries, 4 offices of the church, right? Elder, pastor, doctor, teacher, and deacon, right? So these become the 4 standard ministries and or offices of the church. I think some of our sister denominations say there's only 3 offices. The OPC, I think, says 3, and we say 4. But we say 2. Okay, good. Into one. Okay, right. And he actually, Calvin says there's 3 offices, but 4 ministries. But anyway, this basic chart comes out of this, right? The elders are to govern and supervise the congregations, right? Pastors preach the word. Doctors teach doctrine and eventually serve in the Genevan Academy, and deacons the ministry of mercy. And just, again, I always run out of time, but my first sort of introduction to Presbyterianism, right? I remember when Audrey and I were first married, no kids, and an elder called. We're coming by to check how you're doing spiritually. I thought, what? What is that, right? But that's what we do. Oh, that's the elder's job, right? That's a reformed tradition, right, that doesn't exist in all churches, right? So as a new Presbyterian, I couldn't believe it, right? They're going to come to our little apartment and ask us if we're growing spiritually. And now, of course, yes, that's good, right? But again, so the elder's job is to do that, right? In some sense, right? The company of pastors, important in this scenario, remember, this is a city, not a country. It's not Scotland or England. This is a 13,000 person city. So the company of pastors, all the pastors in Geneva, right, meet weekly to talk about Scripture, talk about how to interpret Scripture, talk about theology, right, and to participate in the government of the church, right? And they will too serve in this consistory. So company of pastors is a really important piece of Calvin's program. He knows that if he's going to reform an entire city that has a Republican form of government, he needs support at all times, right? And the company of pastors is designed for that. And again, he doesn't hold any office other than pastor, right? But he is the moderator of the company of pastors his entire rest of his life, and then Theodore Beza will take over after him. All right, the consistory. Now, this is where we get into those thorny issues of church and state, right? So the consistory is this body that is both ecclesiastical and political, right? Secular. It's actually a standing committee of the government of Geneva. So that's how it functions. It's a committee of the government, right? And yet, it's a committee of the church. So I put it in the middle here, right? Because what he's doing, and this is tricky, right? Calvin's trying to thread the needle. In the early modern world, you've got really two options, right? You can either have a papal monarchy, right? God. Who does God appoint? The Pope or the church. And then they control the state, right? That's a pretty normal way of thinking of church-state relationships, right? God, bishops, state. Bishops rule the state. The Pope rules the state. Erastianism says what? God. Who does God appoint? The king, right? And then who does the king appoint? The church, right? Those are your two basic options, right? So when we talk about like the word theocracy, is a sort of meaningless word in this era, right? Theocracy means what? God. Cracy means rule. So everywhere's a theocracy. Spain's a theocracy, France is a theocracy. Who's in charge? According to the King of France, God, right? So theocracy doesn't get at it. It's this question of, right, is it the church ruling the state, right? Or is it the king ruling the church in some sense? So the reformers want to kind of find a middle way. So that's what this is, right? The Lutherans call it two-kingdom theory, right? And then the other Protestants will take that and run with it and try to do various things. So this is what's happening in Geneva, right? We don't want the state to tell the church what to do. We don't want the church to tell the state what to do. But they must, according to all the reformers, work together, right? They shouldn't ever be separate, right? A separation of church and state. Also, that was not stated until 1801, the first time that phrase was used, right? Separation in the Danbury Association in Virginia was the first time the phrase separation of church and state is used, right? So we're 300 years before that, right? So how do we create something in the middle, right? Two kingdoms or something like that, right? Okay, so that's what we're trying to do here, right? So the consistory is a secular state body and a church body to govern the morality, spiritual life, and doctrine of the citizens. It's appointed, right, run by the government, so the chief officer is one of the syndics of the Senate, right? But the primary members are 12 elders. So you've got a Senate chairman and 12 elders, right? And then the pastors are ex officio. Usually the company of pastors can attend, and they do attend, right? And what's their job is to supervise morality, spiritual life, etc. in Geneva. So this is attempting to fill in this middle, right? We don't want that. We don't want Roman Catholicism, right, in their ecclesiastical structure, nor do we want a secular state like the Church of England, right? King Henry, what's his title? Supreme head of the Church of England. We don't want that either, right? So how do we do something in between? Well, this is the attempt, right? Some kind of working together, but separate spheres. I don't know, quick thoughts. I know we're heading on 11, but quick thoughts on this, this question of how they do this, right? They add an academy and a hospital. Calvin loses on the hospital debate. He wants the deacons to run it. Geneva says, no, the state's going to run it, but we'll use your deacons as help, right? All right, quick thoughts on church-state kind of question.
Just for clarity,
Mm-hmm.
two kingdom means something a little different in today. It's a very specific view of
Okay,
historical positions. And so you use the word sphere too.
yes,
Sphere sovereignty and two kingdom are often opposed to each other, but they're both the children of this two kingdom view. So if
yes,
someone's hearing two kingdoms,
okay, good point.
not necessarily the two kingdom theology that's proposed today.
I don't,
Two kingdom is one version of that.
okay,
But so is sphere sovereignty.
okay,
So
right.
Presbyterian sphere sovereignty is also a version of this. But
Yes.
they're opposed to each other. But
Right.
neither one is what you're talking about is what you're talking about.
Yeah, so
just for clarity.
good. So Luther comes up with this two kingdoms phrase, right? And the Reformed in Zurich and Strasbourg and now Geneva don't want to quite do what Luther's doing, but no one knows exactly what the Germans are doing, right? In the two, so there's state and there's church, but they've got to work together. So this is his attempt at that. Yeah, good point. I'm not up on all the how it's used exactly today. This is an attempt to keep church and state together without being one in charge of the other, right? All right, so this is successful. From 41 to really into the 1550s, he's constant controversy implementing this. And in the 1550s, it becomes very stable. So the last decade of Calvin's life, Geneva is very stable and the church is very stable. So he has about 10 years at the end of his life where things are really stable. All right, we won't go into any of these particular issues. I did want to mention law, though, just because this is how we started, right? One area in which Calvin will have really universal influence is in marriage law, right? And there are other examples too, but this is just one example that is interesting because it pulls together. He's a great synthesizer, right? So Calvin takes the sacramental view that the Catholic Church has, right? That marriage is a sacrament. He says that's not right, but it's still holy, right? And then he takes the emerging secular view, which says marriage is just a contract between two people who want to get married. He says, yes, but it's more than that too, right? So this idea of a covenant marriage that is a spiritual covenant and a secular contract comes together most clearly in Calvin, right? So this is what he's doing throughout his life, is synthesizing traditions and finding what he thinks is a biblical way, right? So marriage is holy, but it's not a sacrament, right? Is it a personal contract between two individuals, freely chosen? Yeah, of course that's what it is. That's an old 1,000-year definition. That's true, but it's still a spiritual covenant, right? So he wants to hold both of these things together, right? Secular contract and spiritual covenant. And it works, right? The marriage laws of Geneva become models for all Northern European countries in some form or another, right? That it is still going to be a religious, right, covenant and a secular contract. It is both, right? So marriage should be done by the state, right? My daughter's getting married next Saturday. So the pastor will sign her thing, right? But she's already married. They already got their license, right? That goes back to Geneva, right? It's not signed yet, right? But they've already been to the courthouse. This is Calvin's view, right? It is supposed to be a secular thing, right? It's not a church thing, but the church still needs to be involved because it's a holy thing, right? So that will stay with us in the West for a long, long time, right? Okay, it is a couple minutes after 11. I left you with some assessments there at the end on Calvin's influence over time. So take a look at those. Take a look at his comments on marriage. Quick thoughts, quick questions, and we'll wrap up. So, yes?
I remember being in the Netherlands, and Christians would go to the state office,
Yes.
get approval, and then they would go to the church and get married.
Exactly, right. And that's still, I mean, that's our procedure really, right? Because the pastor pulls signs it on the day of, right? By the power invested in me by the state of Tennessee, right? That's a very Genevan thing, right? It is secular, and it should be secular, and it is holy and should be holy. So that's an example of one of those laws that Calvin is so influential in. All right. Thanks for your attention. Sorry, that was fast. All right. Thanks. Okay. All right.